And my first question today is, why is the World Bank such a controversial institution? And what impact did former President Wolfensohn have on that aspect?
So you're starting me off with two very simple and brief questions. Well, on the question of why it's been such a target, I think because people are understandably impatient when it comes to global poverty. They don't want to sit around and be told it's very difficult, it takes a long time, look, we're making progress, you know, the glass is slightly half as full than it was 5 years ago. That kind of stuff doesn't really cut it in the public square when you're talking about, you know, life expectancy of under 50 years for some country, you know, very high child mortality rates and so on. So there's a natural and attractive impatience that people have with development that you probably wouldn't see if you were talking about something that didn't kind of hit people in the heart so much. Then there are some other reasons why the World Bank has been unpopular. You know, like any big organization, it's made mistakes. It's gone through different periods in thinking about development. There was a sort of early period in the 50s when it thought that if you built big infrastructure projects and provided financial capital to poor countries, you would be filling the gap between the sort of basically capital was what they lacked. They had plenty of workers. You could see labor all over the place when you went to a poor country. There was no shortage of people. So what this poor country obviously lacked, it was thought, was capital. And if you plugged that gap, then you would get growth. That didn't work. So then there was a move from fixed capital to human capital. Okay, there are lots of people here, but they're not all trained to work productively. They're not all healthy, so you can't be productive if you're suffering from malaria or something. So we need to invest in the human capital. Then beyond the physical capital and the human capital, there came a period of looking at population policies, agricultural technology, a big sort of flowering and broadening of the development agenda. Then in the 80s, all of these projects didn't seem to be working because the economic policy around the projects was wrong. There was hyperinflation, big budget deficits, prices were controlled, so nobody had signals to produce what was really wanted. And so there was a period in the 1980s of thinking about macroeconomic policy. Structural adjustment of the economy became the watchword in the 1980s. And then even that didn't work. And in the 1990s, at least in Africa most notably, there was a thing, okay, we still haven't got it right. Let's think about the politics around the economics. So we've gone from just a few projects to a broader definition of projects, to then the economics around the projects, to then the politics even around the economics. And every time the World Bank changed its story because it was confronting a genuine difficulty in making progress, of course it lays itself open to criticism, saying, well, now you're saying this, but you didn't say it 10 years ago, so you must have been wrong 10 years ago, and therefore you're no good. And the answer to that is, of course, well, nobody else was saying that we should have changed the story 10 years ago. We changed because we have new data, new experience, we've learned lessons. It would be worse if we didn't change our approach in the face of new knowledge. So I think there's a legitimate defense of the World Bank, but nonetheless, any organization which is A, dealing with such emotive issues as desperate poverty, and B, does change its approach every decade or so, is going to be naturally criticized. Now, what difference did James Wolfensohn make? He was the president of the World Bank between 1995 and 2005. And it was a period when he came in of really the absolute, rock bottom in terms of the public perception of the World Bank. There had been protests in 1994 to mark the 50th anniversary of the World Bank's creation at the Bretton Woods Conference. And the slogan was 50 years is enough. Now it's time to shut your doors. And so this was a sort of the left-wingish or leftish kind of critique of the World Bank, that it was too harsh in terms of the economic reforms. It was jamming down poor countries' throats, that when you told a country that it had hyperinflation and a big budget deficit, it had to get control of that, this in effect meant, okay, cut your spending on education and health because you were trying to get that budget deficit under control by spending less. And of course, poor people might suffer from that. And so there was that sort of criticism. There was criticism over the environmental record of the World Bank, because a lot of these big infrastructure projects do have environmental fallout that's difficult to control. And there was sort of human rights-ish kind of criticism of the fact that when you, again, build a big project, you might have to move people from one part of the country where they were living. Now there's going to be a dam. That area is going to be underwater, so you move people, and some of them don't want to move. So what do you do then? You can try to negotiate, you could probably try to handle it properly, but it's not always handled properly. And so there was some criticism of that human rights record. So that was the kind of left-wing basket of criticisms in the 50 Years is Enough campaign. And then on the other side, in the early 1990s, you had the first development of really big private capital flows into the developing, sort of emerging markets, which had been, which were raising the question, okay, so now if private capital will go into these countries, why do we need the public sector World Bank to provide capital to these countries? If the private sector can do it, why do we need the public sector? And so that was the right-wing criticism of the World Bank, the kind of free market criticism. So there was a sort of left-right pincer movement, which I think really did threaten the legitimacy and the longevity of the World Bank. And Jim Wolfensohn came in 1995, 1 year after this 50 Years is Enough campaign. And one of his big achievements, I think, was to slightly push back against the critics, to recast the World Bank in a way that was both attractive to the left and attractive to the right. And he did it by being an unbelievably good and charming salesman. Wolfensohn is a complicated guy, lots of big flaws and lots of big strengths. But one of his strengths was that he could sit down in a room with Oxfam and other NGOs, and before they had time to open their mouths and say, well, there's terrible poverty out there, you're not doing enough about it. Before they had time to say that, he would say, there is terrible poverty out there, and we're not doing enough to fix it. And I was in a village just last week in Africa, and I was sitting under the baobab tree with the local chief, and we were chewing nuts, and he was saying to me how he has this grandson who doesn't have enough to eat. I mean, it's tough. So the poor Oxfam guys who are sort of used to taking the moral upper hand like that don't even get their mouth open half the time. So he was just a fantastic salesman. He knew when he went into a meeting with anybody, how to push their emotional buttons, how to kind of get them on his side. And he did a great job, I think, of bringing the bank from a period where it was really, like I say, attacked from left and right and in real trouble, to a position where it had really established a bit more stability.
Excellent. Do we have a question? Excellent.